Welcome to Phantom Files, where we dive into the most chilling, unexplainable, and downright terrifying stories that will keep you up at night. If you're into spine-tingling encounters and eerie tales that send shivers down your spine, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of thrill seekers. Alright, let's get into it. This one's a New Year's Eve you'll never forget. I've always considered myself someone who leads a pretty straightforward, straight-edge lifestyle. I don't drink, I don't do drugs, and I've never been one to seek out trouble. That's why I can say with absolute certainty that what I saw and experienced last New Year's Eve wasn't some hallucination or the result of an overactive imagination. It was real. I live on the outskirts of a small southern town. You know the type: quiet streets, everyone knows everyone, and the kind of place where life moves a little slower. Some of my friends, though, live even further out into the sticks, where you have to take long, dark, winding country roads just to reach their homes. It's the kind of place where streetlights are almost non-existent, and the shadows between the trees seem to stretch endlessly. One of those friends, Darren, lives in a particularly nice neighborhood, tucked away deep in the woods and only accessible by those back roads. Every year, Darren's family hosts a big New Year's Eve party at their home, a gathering of family friends, neighbors, and of course, people like me. It's become a bit of a tradition, and I always look forward to it when I receive their formal invitation in the mail. The parties are fun, lively, and a great way to ring in the new year. That evening, the air had taken on a sudden chill, a sharp contrast to the unusually warm days we'd been having. It made the drive to Darren's house more uncomfortable than usual. The road leading to his neighborhood was as bumpy and narrow as ever, surrounded by dense forests on either side. It was a black void, the kind of darkness that even my high beams struggled to cut through. Normally, I avoid using my brights. I hate when other drivers blind me with theirs. But on this road, it wasn't a matter of preference, it was a necessity. As I drove, the towering trees on either side of the road loomed over me, their gnarled branches barely illuminated by my headlights. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the darkness brought with it, a sense that I wasn't entirely alone out there. Somewhere along that stretch of road, I passed the old shack. It had been there for as long as I could remember, looking like it hadn't been lived in for years. Yet sometimes, when I drove this way at night, I could swear I saw lights on inside. It gave me the creeps every single time. I shook off the discomfort and kept driving, trying to focus on the party ahead and not the unsettling thoughts swirling in my mind. Little did I know, the night was only beginning. The journey to Darren's New Year's Eve party started off uneventful but quickly took a turn that I'll never forget. As I drove along the dark, winding back roads leading to his house, the dense tree lines on either side seemed to swallow the faint light from my car's headlights. The road was so isolated, and with no streetlights to guide me, I had to rely on my high beams, which I usually avoid using out of courtesy to other drivers. But out here, there were no other cars, just me and the eerie silence of the night. About halfway through the drive, something unusual caught my eye. In the distance, illuminated by my headlights, was a figure standing by the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, completely still and staring out into the woods behind her. Her attire was wildly inappropriate for the cold winter night, and her presence was jarring. As I passed her, I instinctively gripped the wheel tighter. I debated whether I should stop and ask if she needed help, but something about the way she stood there, unmoving, sent a chill down my spine. My gut told me to keep going. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her turn, slowly pivoting to face the direction my car was heading, her gaze locked onto me as I drove away. It wasn't just unsettling, it was terrifying. By the time I reached Darren's house, the uneasy feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the image of that woman standing in the dark, so out of place, so motionless. It set the tone for what would be an unforgettable, and deeply disturbing, night. As the night went on, the party was lively and full of the usual cheer you'd expect on New Year's Eve. Darren's house was warm and inviting, a sharp contrast to the dark, cold roads I had traveled to get there. The sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and celebratory music filled the space, and for a while, I was able to push the memory of the woman by the road out of my mind. The house itself was situated deep within the woods, isolated yet somehow cozy, with a large gravel driveway where cars were neatly parked. Guests were milling about, catching up and enjoying the festive atmosphere. Darren's parents, as always, were gracious hosts, making sure everyone had food, drinks, and a place to feel welcome. As the hours passed, we watched the ball drop in New York and toasted when midnight hit our time zone. By then, people had begun to trickle out, saying their goodbyes and heading home. I lingered a bit longer than most, helping Darren's family tidy up. It felt like the polite thing to do, especially since they'd always been so kind to me. When I finally stepped outside to leave, my car was the only one left in the driveway. The silence of the woods, which earlier had seemed peaceful, now felt oppressive and heavy. The memory of the woman on the road crept back into my mind, and I couldn't shake the strange unease that followed me as I climbed into my car. The festive energy from the party couldn't quite dispel the sense that something wasn't right. As I started my car and prepared to head home, a warning light illuminated on the dashboard, a low tire pressure indicator. My car was an older model, so it didn't specify which tire was the issue, just that something was wrong. I sighed, figuring it was probably due to the sudden drop in temperature over the past few days. This happened every winter, and it usually wasn't anything serious. I told myself it could wait until morning. I just wanted to get home and crawl into bed. Despite the nagging thought of the woman I'd seen earlier, I decided to take the same route back. There was an alternate road I could have used, but it would have added another 20 minutes to my trip, and I wasn't in the mood for a longer drive. Besides, I hadn't seen another car on that road all night, so I figured the chances of running into her, or anyone else, were slim. I reassured myself that it was just some strange coincidence, and nothing more. As I pulled out of Darren's driveway and onto the dark, winding back road, the unease started to settle in my chest again. The darkness seemed even heavier than before, and the dense tree line on either side of the road felt like it was closing in. I tried to focus on the road ahead and not let my imagination run wild. But after only a few minutes of driving, something felt off. My car didn't seem to be handling right. There was a rhythmic scraping sound, like metal grinding against the asphalt. My heart sank as the car gradually came to a halt, refusing to go any farther. Panic started to creep in as I realized I would have to get out of the car to check what was wrong. Against my better judgment, I turned off the engine, plunging myself into total darkness. The forest around me was eerily silent, the only sound coming from the occasional rustle of leaves in the faint breeze. Using my phone's flashlight, I got out and began inspecting the tires. What I saw made my stomach drop. All 4 tires had been shredded, as if they'd been torn apart by something sharp. The rubber was ripped to jagged pieces, far beyond what a simple puncture or road hazard could explain. I knelt down to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, had done this. As I stood there staring at the shredded tires, a creeping realization set in. This wasn't an accident. The thought that someone might still be nearby sent a chill down my spine. I shone my phone's flashlight nervously into the surrounding woods, scanning for any movement. The dense, shadowy trees seemed to watch me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But then, as if the entire forest had taken a deep breath and held it, the wind died completely. The silence was unnerving, oppressive even. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just an overwhelming void of sound. And then I heard it, the unmistakable snap of a twig somewhere in the darkness. My heart leapt into my throat as I whipped my flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam of light only penetrated a few feet into the blackness, but I saw nothing. I stood frozen, listening intently. The crunch of leaves followed, deliberate and slow, as if someone, or something, was pacing through the woods. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car, but my body refused to move. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost sing-song voice breaking the silence. "I see you." The words were spoken calmly, without malice, but that only made them more chilling. It was a woman's voice, gentle and clear, and it came from somewhere just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My breathing hitched as my entire body went cold. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just heard, but then the voice came again, closer this time. "Can you see me?" The second question sent me into a panic. My hands shook as I struggled to keep the flashlight steady. I swept the beam frantically across the tree line, desperate to find the source. And then, just at the edge of the woods, the light landed on her. She was standing there, the woman in the white gown. Her appearance was even more horrifying up close. The gown was filthy, streaked with mud and dark stains I didn't want to identify. Her skin was pale and sallow, stretched tightly over a gaunt frame. Her gray hair hung in tangled clumps down to her elbows. But her face was what made my blood run cold. Half of her jaw was missing, leaving her teeth grotesquely exposed, yet somehow she was grinning at me. For a moment, I was too paralyzed to move. The flashlight beam shook violently in my trembling hand, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. Then, as if a switch flipped in my brain, my fight-or-flight response kicked in. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted down the road, the beam of my flashlight bouncing erratically in front of me. Behind me, I could hear her following. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and the sound of her ragged breathing seemed to grow louder with every step. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, driving me forward as fast as my legs could carry me. All I could think about was getting back to Darren's house, to safety. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, the adrenaline pumping through my veins making every step feel like a desperate bid for survival. The chilling sounds of snapping twigs and rustling leaves followed close behind, echoing in the suffocating silence of the night. My flashlight wavered in my hand, its erratic beam illuminating the dark road just enough to keep me from tripping. Every few seconds, I dared a glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see her grotesque figure lunging toward me. But the darkness behind me revealed nothing except the oppressive shadows of the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was there, just out of sight, closing the distance with every step. Finally, the faint outline of Darren's house came into view. It was like a beacon of hope in the middle of this nightmare. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I forced myself to keep running. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my feet as I reached the front door, pounding on it with every ounce of strength I had left. "Open up! Please open the door!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. The porch light flicked on, and a moment later, Darren's mother opened the door, her face etched with concern. Without hesitation, she ushered me inside, locking the door behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside me. Darren and his father appeared from the living room, their faces a mix of confusion and worry. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words as I recounted the horrifying events of the night. The woman on the road, the shredded tires, her chilling voice in the woods. I told them everything. They listened intently, their expressions growing darker with every detail. Darren's father placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "We'll call the police and get this sorted out." His words brought a small measure of comfort, but the terror still lingered. I couldn't shake the image of her twisted grin, her filthy gown, her hollow eyes. I felt like she was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. As Darren's family made the calls to the authorities and a towing service, they offered me a guest room for the night. I gladly accepted, too shaken to even think about venturing outside again. But even as I lay in the safety of their home, the feeling of being watched refused to leave me. I struggled to fall asleep in the guest room, the events of the night playing on an endless loop in my mind. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that should have been comforting but instead felt oppressive. Every creak of the old wood floors made me jump, and my heart refused to slow its relentless pounding. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself I was safe. Darren's family had been so kind, so reassuring, but the fear wouldn't let go of me. The woman's voice echoed in my ears, "I see you. Can you see me?" It sent chills down my spine every time I thought about it. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I slipped into an uneasy sleep. But it didn't last long. A faint tapping sound woke me. My eyes flew open, and I lay completely still, straining to hear. The tapping came again, a soft, deliberate sound against the window. My pulse quickened, and I turned my head slowly toward the source. The room's windows had no blinds, leaving me exposed to whatever was out there. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to confirm what I already knew in my gut. Then I heard it again. Her voice. "I see you." It was muffled, but there was no mistaking it. My body froze, every muscle locked in terror. She was out there. Somehow, she had followed me all the way to Darren's house. My mind raced. How could she have known I was here? How had she tracked me down so quickly? I clenched my eyes shut, silently begging her to go away. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. The tapping continued, a relentless reminder that she was just on the other side of the glass. "I see you," she whispered again, the words dripping with an unnatural calmness. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was, to not make a sound. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to acknowledge her. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and eventually the tapping stopped. I stayed curled up under the covers, too afraid to even peek out the window. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the darkness, I dared to open my eyes fully and look around. She was gone. When Darren's family woke up, I told them what had happened. We all went outside together to check, but there was no sign of her. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing except the lingering fear that she might still be out there, watching. The morning brought a fragile sense of safety, but the dread lingered. Darren's family did their best to comfort me, assuring me that the woman had likely moved on and that the police would handle it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting. As we gathered in the living room, Darren's father stepped out into the yard to inspect the property. I stood by the window, watching him scan the area with a determined look on his face. A few minutes later, he called us all outside, his voice tense but controlled. In the yard, near the edge of the forest, he pointed to something on the ground. As we approached, my stomach churned. There, lying in the grass, was a large, rusted knife. It was old, the blade pitted and stained, but it was unmistakably dangerous. "She must have left this," Darren's father said grimly, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The woman had been armed the entire time. She had slashed my tires, possibly with this very knife, and she had followed me here. It wasn't just random malice, it felt personal, targeted. We called the police again, and they arrived within the hour. The officers examined the knife carefully, placing it in an evidence bag, and took statements from everyone. Darren's parents mentioned the strange woman seen by one of the guests during the party, but no one had seen her clearly enough to provide a useful description beyond "a woman in a white dress." When the officers asked me if I had any idea why she might have been after me, I could only shake my head. None of it made sense. I didn't know this woman. I'd never seen her before that night on the road. But she had tracked me so precisely, as if she'd been watching me long before I noticed her. The police assured us they'd investigate, focusing on the shack down the road. I felt a flicker of hope that they might find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But deep down, I wasn't optimistic. This woman seemed like the kind of person who wouldn't leave a trail. As the officers drove away, I stood in the yard, staring at the spot where the knife had been. The weight of the night's events pressed down on me, and I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made it back to Darren's house. What was her plan? What did she want from me? The questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. I realized then that I might never know. All I could do was hope she wouldn't come back. But as I walked back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The day following the terrifying encounter was a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. Darren's family tried to keep things light, cooking breakfast and chatting about the new year, but I could feel their concern whenever they glanced in my direction. They didn't need to say it. We all knew the situation was far from normal. The police arrived mid-morning to follow up on their investigation. They had searched the shack I mentioned, but no one was there. What they did find was unsettling: remnants of gutted wildlife scattered around the area. Deer, rabbits, and even birds, all mutilated and left to rot. The officers theorized that someone had been living there, possibly squatting, but the scene they described sounded more ritualistic than practical. It was chilling. I gave the police a more detailed statement about what happened, recounting every detail I could remember about the woman. Her pale, gaunt face, the grotesque deformity of her jaw, and the haunting clarity of her voice echoed in my mind as I spoke. The officers assured me they would patrol the area more frequently, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Whoever this woman was, she seemed adept at avoiding detection. After the police left, Darren's father offered to drive me to retrieve my car. I was hesitant, but I couldn't leave it on that desolate road forever. We took his truck and made our way cautiously back to the spot where I had broken down. As we approached, my anxiety skyrocketed. The road looked just as eerie in the daylight, the bare trees casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. My car was still there, sitting lopsided on its ruined tires. Darren's father parked a safe distance away, and we both got out to inspect it. The damage to the tires was worse than I remembered. Deep, jagged gashes ran through the rubber, as if they had been clawed apart by some feral creature. The sight confirmed what I already knew: this was no accident. Whoever that woman was, she had deliberately disabled my car, ensuring I couldn't escape easily. We called a towing service, and as we waited, Darren's father stood guard, his posture tense and protective. I scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting her to appear at any moment, but the forest remained silent. The tow truck arrived after what felt like an eternity, and the driver quickly loaded my car onto the flatbed. He remarked on the tire damage, shaking his head and muttering about weird folks in the area. I didn't bother explaining. I just wanted to leave. We followed the tow truck back to the nearest repair shop, where they assured me the car would be fixed within a few days. Darren's father offered to lend me a ride until then, and I accepted gratefully. As much as I wanted to put the incident behind me, the image of that woman standing at the edge of the forest was burned into my mind. Her words echoed in my ears: "I see you." Even in the safety of daylight, I couldn't escape the chilling realization that she had targeted me deliberately. And for what reason? That was the question I feared I'd never answer. That evening, after the long and nerve-wracking ordeal of dealing with my car and recounting my experience to the police, I finally returned to Darren's house. I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees surrounding the neighborhood. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still out there, watching from the shadows. Darren's family insisted I stay another night, and I gratefully accepted. The thought of being alone in my apartment was unbearable. They went out of their way to make me feel safe, locking all the doors and windows, leaving lights on in the front yard, and even offering to let me sleep in their living room so I wouldn't feel isolated. After dinner, we tried to distract ourselves by watching a movie, but my mind was elsewhere. Every creak of the house or rustle of leaves outside made me jump. Darren noticed my nerves and suggested playing some board games to keep my mind off things. It worked, at least for a little while. Laughter filled the room, and for a brief moment, I felt normal again. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to catch up with me. I decided to call it a night and head upstairs to the guest room. Darren's mother assured me I could wake them up at any time if I felt uneasy. They even left their bedroom door slightly ajar, a small but comforting gesture. When I entered the guest room, I immediately checked the windows. They were locked, but that didn't stop me from pulling the heavy curtains shut. I also moved a chair in front of the door, not because I thought it would stop anyone, but because it made me feel slightly more secure. I left the bedside lamp on as I climbed into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the events of the previous night over and over, like a haunting film reel I couldn't turn off. The woman's grotesque face, her voice calling out, "I see you." The chase through the woods, it was all too vivid. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there at the edge of the trees, her gown stained and torn, her hollow gaze fixed on me. Sometime after midnight, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. My dreams were plagued by shadows moving through the forest, and I woke up several times, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something outside. Each time, I forced myself to check the windows and reassure myself that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't truly feel safe until I was far away from this place. The morning came with a sense of both relief and dread. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the heavy curtains, illuminating the room and providing a false sense of security. I woke up to the sound of soft voices downstairs. Darren's family was already up and preparing breakfast. For a brief moment, I felt normal, as if the events of the past 2 nights had been nothing more than a bad dream. I got out of bed, moved the chair I had barricaded against the door, and headed downstairs. The smell of coffee and bacon greeted me, and Darren's mother gave me a warm smile, asking how I'd slept. I didn't want to ruin the mood, so I said I slept better than I expected. In reality, I had barely slept at all. Over breakfast, we talked about the woman in the woods. Darren's father mentioned he had already spoken to the police again that morning to follow up on their investigation. They assured him they were sending officers to the area where I had encountered her, as well as to the abandoned shack I had described. Despite their reassurances, the thought of her still being out there sent a chill down my spine. When breakfast was over, Darren offered to drive me to where my car had been left. I hesitated for a moment, the memory of those gutted tires and the woman's voice echoing in my mind. But I knew I couldn't leave my car there indefinitely. With Darren by my side, I felt a little braver. We set off together, driving back down the same dark road where the nightmare had begun. This time, in the safety of daylight, the road looked less menacing. The dense trees on either side didn't seem as imposing, and the eerie silence of the night was replaced by the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Still, I couldn't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see her standing there again, watching. When we reached the spot where I had left my car, I was relieved to see a tow truck already there. The driver was just finishing up loading my car onto the flatbed. Darren and I got out of his car, and I thanked the tow truck driver profusely. He asked what had happened to the tires, and I gave him a vague explanation about an incident with an animal. I didn't want to sound crazy or have to recount the full story again. Once everything was set, I climbed into Darren's car, and we followed the tow truck back into town. Even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching from the woods. I told myself it was over, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The following night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Despite being back home and safe, every little noise made me jump. I had double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows, drawn the curtains tightly, and kept my phone close at hand. Yet I couldn't rid myself of the sense that someone, or something, was watching me. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but my mind kept drifting back to the events of New Year's Eve. The image of the woman in white, her grotesque face illuminated by my flashlight, was burned into my memory. I kept hearing her voice in my head. "I see you. Can you see me?" Just as I was beginning to relax, a noise startled me, a faint tapping sound, coming from the window in the living room. My heart skipped a beat. At first I thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind or some animal brushing against the glass. But when the tapping came again, more deliberate this time, I froze. I stood up slowly, my pulse quickening as I approached the window. My living room lights were on, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. My reflection stared back at me, obscuring whatever might be beyond the glass. I debated turning off the lights to see more clearly, but the thought of standing in the dark was too terrifying. Then, the tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting. The silence stretched on, and just when I began to convince myself it was nothing, my phone buzzed on the table. I nearly screamed at the sudden noise. Picking it up, I saw a text from Darren. "Did you hear back from the police yet?" I quickly replied, telling him I hadn't, but before I could finish typing, a knock echoed through the house. This time, It wasn't a faint tap, it was a firm, deliberate knock at the front door. Panic surged through me. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and no one had called or texted to say they were stopping by. I crept toward the door, my hands shaking, and peeked through the peephole. My blood ran cold. The porch was empty. I locked the door and backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed Darren's number, explaining what was happening in hushed, frantic tones. He told me to stay put and that he would come over right away. While I waited, I armed myself with the largest kitchen knife I could find, retreating to a corner of the room where I could see both the front and back doors. Minutes felt like hours. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. When Darren finally arrived and knocked on the door, I nearly burst into tears of relief. He entered cautiously, scanning the room as if expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. We searched the entire house and the surrounding yard together but found no one. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. It was as if the knock had come from nowhere. Darren insisted on staying the night, and while his presence was comforting, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face again, staring at me with that unnerving grin. The next morning, Darren and I decided to follow up with the police regarding the investigation near the shack I had mentioned. After a restless night, I needed answers, something to explain the terrifying series of events that had unfolded over the past few days. Darren made the call, and after a brief discussion, the officer on the line told us to come down to the station for an update. When we arrived, the officer informed us that they had conducted a thorough search of the shack and its surroundings. The building was indeed abandoned, as I had suspected, but what they found inside was chilling. There were makeshift bedding arrangements, indicating that someone had been living there recently. In one corner of the shack, they discovered a collection of items that didn't belong, pieces of clothing, random trinkets, and even what appeared to be a journal. The officer described the journal as incoherent ramblings, filled with strange drawings and phrases like, "I see you," scrawled repeatedly across the pages. What was even more disturbing was that some of the items matched descriptions of belongings reported missing by residents in the area. It seemed the woman, or whoever had been living there, had been stealing from homes along those dark country roads. The police were still trying to piece together how she had tracked me and why she had singled me out, but they had no concrete leads. I asked if they had found her, but the officer shook his head. There was no sign of the woman anywhere. No footprints leading away from the shack, no personal belongings left behind, nothing. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Before we left, the officer handed me a photograph they had found in the shack. It was old and slightly torn, but my heart dropped when I saw it. The woman in the photo was wearing the same white gown I had seen her in, and her face, while not as grotesque as it had appeared in the flashlight, still carried a haunting, hollow expression. The officer couldn't say who the woman was or how long the photo had been in the shack, but he assured me they would keep looking into it. Darren and I drove back to his house in silence, both of us unsettled by what we had learned. The idea that this woman was still out there, possibly watching, sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that I hadn't seen the last of her. As days turned into weeks, the eerie encounter left an indelible mark on my life. Though the woman in white was never found, her image haunted my dreams and every shadow I passed in the night. Darren and his family continued to check in on me, offering reassurance, but the lingering question remained, who was she, and why had she targeted me? I've since taken more precautions in my life, staying in well-lit areas, traveling with others when possible, and investing in home security. It's hard to feel truly safe after an experience like that, but I've come to realize that staying vigilant and prepared is the best I can do. Even so, I can't help but feel that her chilling voice, whispering, "I see you," will stay with me forever. And that's all for today's story. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching Phantom Files, where we bring the most unsettling and mysterious stories to life. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another chilling tale. Let me know in the comments what you think about today's story. What would you have done in my shoes? Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, not everything in the dark is what it seems. See you in the next episode of Phantom Files.